Today, we're looking back at the 1920s for an adventure you can't forget, even if you try. Some might call the 1920s the start of modern times, but what kind of art defined the 1920s? Why was it made? And what can it tell us about the 2020s? This is the art that defined the Roaring 20s. First, some context. Two things really set the stage for the 1920s. World War I ended in 1918, and it kind of changed the Western world forever. Looking back, World War I seems pretty ridiculous, but the basic outcome was the end of ruling monarchies in Europe. World War I saw the fall of Austria-Hungary, one of the biggest empires in Europe, and Russia had a communist revolution. The absence of monarchies paved the way for new forms of power abuse, but those were just getting started in the 1920s. World War I caused massive death and destruction, but just as it was wrapping up, the influenza wiped out up to 5% of the world's population. World War I and the flu pandemic threw the world into a tailspin. Nothing made sense. The old world had fallen and culture was in the hands of the people. Artists picked up the pieces of their fallen world and put them back together in ways never seen before. Art movements like the Pre-Raphaelites and the Cubists were already trying to change the traditional art establishment, but when the photograph became super widespread, realistic paintings seemed just plain silly. Dada turned the art world on its head for good. Dada is a made-up word. It doesn't mean anything, that's the point. Even the Dada Manifesto is a joke making fun of previous art manifestos. It says Dada, an international word, just a word, and the word a movement. Very easy to understand, quite terribly simple. To make of it an artistic tendency must mean that one is anticipating complications. Although the movement claimed no set rules, Dada art has some common things. It plays with reality in unexpected ways. It mixes mediums, for example, a photograph of a sculpture or a photo collage. Dada is all about looking at the world in a new, non-literal way. What do you see first in this photograph? What do you ignore or see second? You might also hear the term surrealist used to describe this period of art. Surreal means very strange, more like a dream than reality, with ideas and images mixed together in a very strange way. Dreams are our brain's ways of processing and organizing while we sleep. This means they can mean nothing or they can be very powerful. Dadaists were fascinated with the liminal space between dreams and reality. But it's not all so esoteric. Dadaists gave us a very fun medium we still use a lot today called the collage, which was then known as the photomontage. The explosion of magazines, newspapers, and other cheap printed media meant artists could use other people's images to create something entirely new. Khan Academy says, the reputation of photography as a factual record implies a truth to reality that can make the absurdity of Dada photomontages disturbing. This image was made in the 1930s, but I think it really captures Dada's essence. This is a woman made of pieces of other women. The result is amusing, captivating, and somewhat uncomfortable. To some extent, Dada art was also about deconstructing and reconstructing humanity. You can understand the urge after the violent technologies of World War I led people to question what they were really made of, and if they were really stronger than technology. You see a lot of body parts in Dada art, internal and external. A lot of people didn't like Dada because it didn't make sense on purpose. But I think you'll find that it does make sense, or maybe it doesn't, because maybe life doesn't. In any case, Dada art defined the Roaring 20s. The 1920s is also known as the Jazz Age. Jazz blended Black and African musical traditions with genres like ragtime and vaudeville. Ragtime and vaudeville were basically live, often improvised piano performances set to plays or just to the vibe of a crowd. Like Dada, jazz also used things the traditional music establishment found unpleasant, like blue notes or polyphonic chords. One of the most legendary composers of the 1920s was Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington and his orchestra was the house band for New York City's Cotton Club in Harlem from 1924 to 1931. Listen to this jazz standard from the film Black and Tan Fantasy. A jazz standard is a song that everybody knows and can play along with without sheet music. This allows musicians to experiment within the structure of the song. This freedom of music led to freedom of movement, as seen here on Miss Josephine Baker, one of the 1920s most exciting dancers, or on these young people doing something called the varsity drag. Jazz has an electric energy. It's fun to dance to, it has a freedom that makes it fresh, and it allows people to express themselves. Young people loved it, and this permission to experiment morphed into music styles like freestyle rap or even jam bands like the Grateful Dead. Jazz really made the 20s roar. Those are the broad strokes for the art that defined the 1920s, but let's take a closer look at some pieces. This title card of Metropolis reads, "The mediator between the hands and the head must be the heart." What does it mean? To me, it means just because you can doesn't mean you should. This is the message behind Fritz Lang's Metropolis. Almost 100 years later, Metropolis is still considered one of the greatest films of all time. The machine mensch, or robot woman, is one of the most iconic silhouettes to this day. Remember how people were experimenting with new rules and mashups of all the broken things that came before? This was really true in Germany. Germany lost World War I and spent the years that followed with an impossible war debt. The government of Germany constantly fluctuated in the 1920s, which meant that for a lot of years there were basically no rules and people were free to imagine utopias and dystopias as they pleased. Metropolis is a dystopia. The working and ruling classes are stratified by literal layers of the earth. The workers are oppressed by the greed of the rulers. Even though the message of Metropolis is hopeful and egalitarian, I sometimes worry that this movie gave rich people bad ideas. Also in Metropolis, an AI incites the masses to violence for her own amusement. Whoops! This science fiction epic informed how a lot of cities actually ended up looking. Chances are, even if you haven't seen Metropolis, you've seen Metropolis. Of all the images created in the 1920s, I'd say this one's the crown jewel. This is the painting used for the cover of the first edition of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. It's called Celestial Eyes, and it was painted by Francis Cugat. It depicts a flapper's face in the sky above a nighttime cityscape reminiscent of Coney Island. The woman's eyes have other naked women inside of them, and her tear masquerades as city lights on a foggy night. The color blue is used quite literally here. It represents sadness or perhaps depression, as the narrator, Nick Carraway, writes this story from a mental health center. The omnipresent sky eyes suggest that perhaps God is a woman, and she is saddened by what she sees here. The luminous city is a garden of earthly delights, but the crushing blue of the sky makes it seem small. Glamour is fleeting, and when it fades, we are left with what's real. Cugat worked for Scribner's in 1924 when he got a commission for a novel, which was then called Among Ash Heaps and Millionaires. It was later retitled The Great Gatsby. According to F. Scott Fitzgerald's editor, when F. Scott saw the painting, he said, "For Christ's sake, don't give anyone that jacket you're saving for me. I've written it into the book." He meant the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, the ominous billboard that looms over the limbo between the characters' glamorous lives in Long Island and their shady business in New York City. The eyes see all, even when the novel's rich protagonists wish to hide. I think The Great Gatsby is, without a doubt, one of the greatest American novels. There are so many meanings and interpretations, but the general gist is that the American dream is a fantasy. There's nothing noble about wealth, and more often than not, wealthy people don't deserve the power and influence they've endowed themselves with. It's kind of a similar theme to Metropolis. The Great Gatsby turns 100 years old this year, and it still resonates. To boot, the 2013 Baz Luhrmann film pretty much defined our present-day image of the 1920s. And I gotta stand by the production design. Catherine Martin and Baz Luhrmann use opulence to illustrate the dazzling emptiness of desire. The 1920s were a period of experimentation and change. The party came to a crashing halt when the global stock market crashed in 1929. Basically because people were spending money they didn't actually have, they were following rules that weren't actually real, and they were relying on people that didn't actually know what they were doing. But that was 100 years ago, right? We wouldn't make those same mistakes again. Well, those are my picks for the art that defined the Roaring '20s. What resonated with you? Do you see any of this stuff popping up today? What pieces do you love from the 1920s? Let me know in the comments. I hope you use this video as a jumping off point to explore more of what interests you. Thanks so much for watching. Take care, everybody. Cheers.